It was a warm May evening in 2018 when Luke made the worst decision of his life. Luke Daniels was a 20-year-old college sophomore with a lot of confidence and not much fear. He had grown up hearing ghost stories, but to him, they were just that, stories. The kind that parents tell their kids to keep them out of trouble, or that thrill seekers invent to spice up a boring night. He didn't believe in any of it. His older sister, Emily, had always been more careful. She had a healthy respect for the unknown, the things you can't explain. Emily was the type to listen to those whispers of caution, the kind that warned you away from dark alleyways and abandoned buildings. But Luke? He thrived on challenges. The scarier the story, the more determined he was to prove that fear was for the weak. That's why, when his friends dared him to explore the old, abandoned Crestview College, Luke didn't think twice. It was a bet. Nothing more. A chance to prove his bravery and show his friends that there was nothing to be scared of in the old, run-down building. Crestview College had been abandoned for nearly a decade, ever since some scandalous rumors surfaced about unauthorized experiments being conducted in its science labs. The authorities shut it down after discovering that the school had been using cadavers for unlicensed experiments. The research, which should have been theoretical, had crossed into something much darker. And there were whispers that the bodies used in the experiments had never been properly dealt with. Instead, they were left behind when the college was closed down, forgotten by everyone, except for those who dared to enter the building. The stories of strange noises, ghostly figures, and bizarre occurrences around Crestview spread through the town of Boulder, Colorado, like wildfire. It became a local legend, a rite of passage for anyone looking to prove they had guts. Everyone knew the rumors, but few had ever ventured inside. Those who did often came back with stories that were quickly dismissed as pranks or exaggerated tales meant to keep the myths alive. But Luke didn't buy it for a second. Ghosts aren't real, he had told Emily that night as he packed his flashlight and a few snacks into his backpack. It's just an old building. People are scared because it's creepy, not because there's anything actually dangerous there. Emily had tried to stop him. You don't know that, Luke. There's a reason people stay away from that place. It's not just about ghosts. The place is falling apart. What if you get hurt? Or worse, what if something happens that you can't explain? But Luke brushed off her concern with a cocky smile. I'll be fine. I've got my phone, I've got my flashlight, and if anything goes wrong, I'll get out of there. Don't worry about it. That night, Luke texted Emily around 9 p.m., telling her that he was staying at a friend's house. What he didn't tell her was that his friend's house was just a cover story. Instead, Luke and his two buddies, Matt and Tyler, were driving toward Crestview College, ready to sneak in and explore the building that had been the source of so many terrifying tales. The drive to Crestview was eerie. As they left the bustling streets of Boulder behind, the roads became quieter, the houses fewer, and the streetlights more distant. The college itself sat on the edge of town, surrounded by woods and thick underbrush, making it even more secluded. When they finally arrived, the sight of the dilapidated building made Luke's heart skip a beat. Crestview College was enormous. Its once grand facade was now crumbling, with ivy creeping up the walls and windows shattered by years of neglect. The front gate, rusted and barely hanging on its hinges, creaked ominously in the wind. The building loomed in the moonlight, casting long shadows that seemed to shift and move on their own. Well, here we are, Luke said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. Matt chuckled nervously. This place is even creepier than I thought. Tyler shook his head. Yeah, no kidding. I didn't think it'd look this bad. For a moment, Luke hesitated, but then he reminded himself that this was a dare, nothing more. There was nothing to be scared of. It was just an old building. With a deep breath, he pushed the gate open, the metal groaning in protest. The three of them stepped inside, their footsteps crunching on the overgrown gravel path that led to the front entrance. Luke's flashlight beam bounced around, illuminating patches of broken brick, dead plants, and empty windows. The air was thick, the kind of stillness that makes you feel like something is watching you. But Luke pushed that thought out of his mind. He wasn't about to let his imagination get the best of him. The front doors of the college were ajar, hanging crookedly on their hinges. Luke nudged one of them open with his foot, and the heavy wooden door creaked loudly as it swung inward. The darkness inside was suffocating. Even with the flashlight, the shadows seemed to cling to everything, like they didn't want to be disturbed. "All right," Luke said, stepping inside. "Let's find this haunted lab and get it over with." They walked into the main hallway, the beam of their flashlights illuminating the debris and grime that had accumulated over the years. The walls were peeling, and the smell of dampness and rot filled the air. It was a smell that clung to the back of your throat, making you want to cough or gag. As they moved deeper into the building, the atmosphere grew more oppressive. The faintest sounds, like the creaking of the floorboards under their feet, echoed unnaturally, amplifying every small noise. Luke could hear his friends breathing behind him, their footsteps keeping in time with his. But occasionally, he felt like there was another set of footsteps just behind him. When he glanced back, there was nothing but empty space. The ground floor was uneventful. Dust and dirt covered everything, and the only signs of life were the occasional rats scurrying through the halls and a few birds that had made nests in the rafters. The rooms they entered were empty, filled with old desks and broken lab equipment. There was nothing there, just as Luke had expected. As they ascended the stairs to the first floor, the air grew colder. The once faint smell of rot became overpowering, filling their lungs with every breath. The first floor was where the science labs were located, and it was where most of the ghost stories centered. Luke led the way, his flashlight scanning the darkened halls. They found the door to the old biology lab, the same one that had been the source of all the rumors about the experiments. The door was locked, but the wood was so old that with one good shove, Luke managed to break it open. The lab was a mess. Tables were overturned, glass beakers shattered on the floor, and the walls were stained with something dark that Luke didn't want to think about. The air in the room was stale, thick with the smell of chemicals, and something else, something foul. "All right, we're here," Luke said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Let's take a look around." They split up, each of them exploring different corners of the lab. Luke's heart was pounding in his chest, but he kept telling himself it was just nerves. There was nothing here. It was just an old building with a dark history. The smell of decay was getting stronger, and Luke started to feel lightheaded. Suddenly, there was a noise, a soft, shuffling sound, like someone was moving in the corner of the room. "Matt? Tyler?" Luke called out, but neither of them answered. He swung his flashlight toward the noise, but there was nothing there, just empty space. He let out a shaky breath, laughing nervously at himself. "Get it together, Luke," he muttered, but the sense of unease only grew. As he moved deeper into the lab, he felt something, a presence. It was like someone was standing just behind him, watching his every move. The hair on the back of his neck stood up, and his skin prickled with fear. When he turned around, there was nothing but the darkness. And then, the smell hit him. It was unlike anything he had ever smelled before. A putrid, rotting odor that made his stomach churn. It was so strong that it burned his nose and made his eyes water. He gagged, covering his mouth with his arm, but it didn't help. "What the hell is that?" Tyler's voice cut through the silence. "I don't know," Luke replied, his voice shaking. "But we need to get out of here." Suddenly there was a loud crash from somewhere above them, followed by the sound of footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps like someone was walking across the floor above them. The three of them froze, their eyes wide with fear. "Did you hear that?" Matt whispered. "Yeah," Luke replied, his heart racing. "We need to go, now." They hurried toward the door, but as they did, the footsteps grew louder. They weren't just above them anymore. They were everywhere. It sounded like there were dozens of people running through the building, their footsteps echoing off the walls. Panic set in, and they ran. Luke's breath came in ragged gasps as he sprinted down the hall, his flashlight bouncing wildly in his hand. The footsteps were right behind him, getting closer with every second. He could feel the presence again, closer this time, like someone was breathing down his neck. As they reached the stairwell, Luke glanced back, and that's when he saw it. A figure stood at the end of the hallway, barely visible in the dim light. It was tall and thin, with pale skin and eyes that glowed faintly in the dark. Its face was twisted, deformed, like it had been stretched and pulled into something unnatural. Its mouth hung open in a silent scream, and its eyes were fixed on Luke. Luke froze, his blood turning to ice. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The figure took a step toward him, its movements slow and deliberate, like it was savoring the moment. Luke wanted to scream, but no sound came out. "Luke! Come on!" Matt's voice snapped him out of his trance, and he bolted down the stairs, the sound of the figure's footsteps following him. They burst through the front doors and ran across the overgrown lawn, not stopping until they reached the car. Luke's hands were shaking so badly that it took him 3 tries to get the key into the ignition. When the engine finally roared to life, they sped away, not looking back until Crestview College was far behind them. That night, Luke didn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the figure, its twisted face, burned into his mind. The next morning, he woke up feeling drained, like the weight of the night before had settled deep into his bones. But the worst part was that the presence hadn't left him. Over the next few days, Luke's behavior changed. He became withdrawn, refusing to leave his room or talk to anyone. Emily noticed the change immediately and tried to get him to open up, but Luke just shook his head, refusing to speak about what had happened. Then the nightmare started. Every night, Luke would wake up drenched in sweat, the figure from Crestview standing at the foot of his bed, watching him. It didn't speak, didn't move, just stood there, its glowing eyes fixed on him. No matter how many times he tried to convince himself it wasn't real, the terror wouldn't go away. The smell came next. That same foul, rotting smell from the college began to fill his room, so strong that it made him gag. No one else could smell it, but to Luke, it was overwhelming. It was a constant reminder that the presence hadn't left him. It was still there, watching, waiting. One night, Emily found Luke huddled in the corner of his room, rocking back and forth, muttering to himself. His eyes were wide with fear, and his skin was pale and clammy. "He's here," Luke whispered, his voice trembling. "He followed me. He won't leave me alone." Emily tried to calm him down, but nothing worked. Luke's paranoia grew worse with each passing day. He refused to leave the house, convinced that the figure was waiting for him outside. He covered the mirrors in his room, afraid that he would see the figure's reflection. The once confident, fearless Luke was now a shell of his former self, consumed by fear and paranoia. Emily begged him to see a therapist, but Luke refused. "He'll find me," he said. "If I leave, he'll find me." Weeks turned into months, and Luke's condition only worsened. He barely ate, barely slept. The doctor said he was suffering from severe trauma, but no one could explain the things Luke was experiencing. One night, Emily woke up to the sound of Luke screaming. She rushed to his room, but when she opened the door, she found him standing in front of the mirror, his eyes wide with terror. "He's here," Luke whispered, his voice barely audible. "He's here." Emily looked into the mirror, and there, standing behind Luke, was the figure. Its glowing eyes stared back at her, and for a moment she felt the same cold, paralyzing fear that Luke had described. She blinked, and the figure was gone, but the terror remained. Emily took Luke's hand, her heart pounding in her chest. "We're going to get through this," she said, her voice trembling. "We're going to make it." But deep down, she knew that the haunting of Crestview College had left a mark on Luke that would never fade.